A war. This isn't a game. In fact, it's probably the greatest culture war of the last 1,000 years that we're fighting here. And the information activists are on the cutting edge. Without us, without the hackers, you are all doomed to live in a dystopian world that will make George Orwell look like a picnic in the park. And so it's a war. It's a serious business war, and people are being caged, people are being killed. We're already in cyber World War III. I mean, I think that the great world conflict has already begun, and it began in cyberspace. And we're seeing the symptoms of that become kinetic. And then global, that just kind of the idea that the whole world really needs to be involved in this. We need to start looking, thinking of ourselves not as Americans, not as Mexicans, not as Ecuadorians, but as citizens of a tiny little rock spinning around this burning ember called the sun. And we need to adopt that mentality, or a lot of bad things are going to happen. One, we're probably going to destroy ourselves, and two, we're more likely to probably cook ourselves alive because we're destroying the planet. About 35 years ago, I got involved in the Free Mandela movement and the anti-apartheid movement. Now that was pre-internet, that's the 80s, so it was boots on the ground. Pirate radio, picture pirate radio, but with a backpack, with a little rubber ducky antenna that would come out, and the guy would have a microphone and he would run around to protest. And if you see the cops coming down Massachusetts Avenue in Boston, he would say, hey, the cops are coming down Massachusetts Avenue, everybody should go this way. And we would put on the protest posters in tiny little print, we would put the frequency that we were using that day and tell everybody to bring their transistor radios. So even back then, the idea of networking, the idea of using technology to try to make the protests better, more effective, was something that was my particular forte. Well, I love direct action. I absolutely believe in direct action, of course. In fact, my view was tempered by my involvement with the Earth Liberation Front in the 80s, the Animal Liberation Front. I was involved in many direct actions that were considered by the U.S. government to be terrorism. I got involved in the Animal Liberation Front in the, I think it was the late 80s going into the early 90s. And I did several years. I was based out of Northern California, the Bay Area, and we would go up to Oregon and Washington State. And we had a list of fur farms that were producing, and we would camp out in the forest and we would stake these farms out, and then we had equipment, we had radios and black clothing, and you can just imagine it was pretty well thought out and well planned. We never did get caught, and we would go into these farms and basically just open the cages and run, just let the creatures run. Guess what? As of like 5 or 10 years ago, minks are now the #1 invasive species, wild invasive species in Washington. So apparently they're just fine with being free.
This document alleges that I am the notorious hacker activist known to the world as Commander X. I am Commander X. The indictment further alleges that I am in association with the global internet freedom movement known as Anonymous. I say yes. I am immensely proud, humbled to the core, part of the idea called anonymous?
I am Commander X, yeah, I know. I had no choice. I was originally captured by the FBI and then released. So when they captured me, they accused me of being Commander X. And then against my lawyer's advice, I held a press conference on the courthouse steps. And I claimed that namespace. And I did that for several reasons. One of them was, by then, X had become very powerful in the movement. When you look at these Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charges, you have a lot of people on the on the chessboard here. One of the big factions in the United States of America, there's a character that, if you're familiar with hacking culture, I'm sure you've heard of him. He's kind of considered my arch nemesis, and that's the Jester. And if you look at the Jester and his whole little cult of personality, they're patriot hackers, you know what I mean? They're all, by their own admission, ex-military, ex-intelligence people who do the same thing as Anonymous. They go out and they DDoS, they hack websites. They took down RT television network just to stop a broadcast of Julian Assange's show.
Free work.
You will never see a member of the Jester's crew in the dock for Computer Fraud and Abuse Act charges in America. So that means that he is informally sanctioned by the fact that he'll never be investigated, by the fact that he'll never be, and none of his people even will ever be prosecuted. They are essentially state-sanctioned hacktivists. Let's face it, it's impossible that Mexico would turn a political prisoner over to the U.S. in this current environment. So the possibility of my extradition to the United States is zero. And so that's kind of why. But what prompted it, what precipitated it, was the election of Donald Trump. I expected the government of Mexico to obey their own constitution. I expect them to obey the laws as they are laid out in the Comar Refugee Act, the OAS Refugee and Asylum Treaty. I invoke my rights under the UN Human Rights Accord, and under that OAS treaty, and under the Mexican Constitution, I invoke all of my rights. And if my rights are truly respected as they are laid out in all of those instruments, then Mexico has no choice but to grant me political asylum. And that's what I expect. I expect them to follow their own law. We released a press release when I arrived in country on November 5th, which, by the way, was Guy Fawkes Day. I actually waited an extra day in the desert to come across, just to make sure I came across on Guy Fawkes Day. But,
Remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason, and plot.
And we issued a press release, and I also issued an open letter to the Mexican government and the Mexican people. And that was my sort of way of saying, hi, I'm here. I've never hidden. For the first time in human history, we are in a position where we can effectively wield ones and zeros, just pure digital information, and effect as much, if not more, change than you can with kinetic force. So I think Anonymous is very apolitical. But in order to understand, Anonymous is not the only game in town. Anonymous is a front of probably the main front in the idea of information activism, which is a very generic idea, a very apolitical idea. The idea that information should be free, that the internet, primarily Anonymous's biggest focus is the idea that the internet should be free and accessible to everybody always. And that from this, all good things will come. It is the cornucopia from which all good things will come, including any kind of political change that a particular person desires. You know, one of the things that you're dealing with an open movement, anybody can be anonymous, anybody can fly that flag. As a crypto-anarchist, I'm a pragmatist. I'm not looking to get rid of government. There is no anarchist utopia. Everybody has a say in our world, and many, many people feel comfortable having authority over them. They feel comfortable having a government. So I'm not trying to impose. That's fascism. If you're trying to take your mindset, anarchists who believe that they're going to completely destroy all governments are fascists. Because you're trying to impose a world that the rest of the world doesn't actually want. One of the things that's happened to me on a personal level is I've become so focused on this online persona known as X that I have forgotten who I am as a man. And I've let parts of my personal character and parts of my personal life and relationships have become severely degraded. If what we have given to the world in anonymous and information activism, if it ends up being the key to the liberation of mankind, then I'm okay if I lose my freedom, I'm okay if I die.